Okay, well, there's people still trickling in, but we might as well get started. So I'd like to welcome everybody to the Edmonton Region Hydrogen Hub webinar series. My name is Mark Lee Wilson. I'm with the Transition Accelerator. Today's topic's a really exciting one, building minimum viable corridors for heavy-duty trucks in Canada. And really what we're going to talk about is an actionable framework that breaks through this circular discussion about next steps. We want to figure out how to move past pilot projects and get towards an economically self-sustaining hydrogen value chain for heavy-duty transportation. I see people are kind of already know our protocol. We encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat. Use the Q&A for questions and answers. We'll address the questions at the end of the webinar. And a recording of this webinar will be made available afterwards. So maybe just next slide. So I just want to provide a little bit of context. Our organization, the Transition Accelerator, what we are is we're a pan-Canadian organization. We have staff actually coast to coast, literally from Victoria, BC, all the way to St. John's, Newfoundland. And we exist to support Canada to get to a competitive net zero future, of which hydrogen is a key part of that. And our role within the Edmonton Region Hydrogen Hub is to understand the various pathways towards a competitive hydrogen economy through both rigorous analysis rooted in facts and data, but also through engagement with stakeholders, real stakeholders, the ones that are going to be the actual investors and actors along the hydrogen value chain. For the last 9 months to 12 months or so, we've been working really hard to understand the obstacles specifically for adopting hydrogen at scale as a fuel for heavy-duty transportation. This included engaging with dozens and dozens of organizations. We had an engagement workshop series last fall over the winter. We did tell participants that we would come back to them with a sort of what we've heard piece. This is that, I guess, but I think we're actually going well beyond that, and we're bringing more value than just a what we've heard. And we're bringing what we feel is a bit of a breakthrough framework. And next slide. So I'm going to pass it to my colleague Phil to talk about that. But first, I do want to recognize that we understand that we do live on and work on traditional land of First Nations communities, and we truly respect that and consider them colleagues and partners on this journey towards competitive net zero future economy. For me personally, I'm in Edmonton, and that means the communities that include the Cree, the Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, Nakota Sioux, and others. And we'd encourage everyone watching to reflect on the territories and treaties that and the people where you live and work. So I will introduce Phil. Phil is the director of Net Zero Fuels with the Transition Accelerator. He has over 20 years experience in the hydrogen industry in both technical and leadership roles, in the leading safety and performance testing of hydrogen systems, including infrastructure and vehicles. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Phil, for the talk. Looking forward to this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark. Just on the territories that I'm actually joining you all from New Westminster, BC, a suburb of Vancouver. And that's the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Halkomelem-speaking peoples, such as the Kikite First Nations, as well as all Coast Salish peoples. For me, I'm committed to learning about and understanding the history and legacy of colonialism and working towards reconciliation with local First Nations and Indigenous peoples. So thanks for that intro, Mark. Let's get right into it. So we're starting right up front with the problem statement. So Canada has been struggling with accelerating the use of hydrogen in long-haul heavy trucking, the classic supply-demand circular discussions. And this is because the sequence of steps beyond pilot projects required to get economic viability have not been clearly defined. And that's because the requirements for viability have not been defined. So it's quite a logical argument that we're going to be structuring here today. And we'll explore the qualitative and quantitative requirements needed to deploy economically self-sustaining hydrogen corridors for long-haul heavy trucks. But before we dive into things, let's quickly set the context for those that might be wondering why we're jumping into necessarily hydrogen for trucking. So this is bigger than Canada legislating the transition to net zero. This is the Net Zero Accountability Act. And it's because much of the world is moving to net zero. We're now in a global competition of energy producing nations, which Canada is amongst, positioning themselves to supply the energy carriers of the future. Now, electricity and hydrogen are emerging as the key energy carriers of the future. I don't think anyone can really credibly challenge electricity's future dominance as part of the energy mix. But why hydrogen? And so, as you can see from the slide here, I mean, electricity has huge limitations. You can't electrify everything, even with what's in the technology pipeline, solid state batteries, and things like that. There are some end uses that simply aren't feasible to electrify. You can't export electricity globally. We certainly do export electricity to our southern neighbors. But the regions that buy our other forms of energy are overseas. And so we want to ensure that Canada's resources aren't stranded. And it's not possible to increase electricity production to meet the expected energy needs by 2050 without these other energy carriers. And so hydrogen is better suited for many end uses and provides additive economic opportunity for Canada. And so it's better suited. I think the expert consensus is fairly clear that it's better suited to moving big things. So really big trucks, long distances. Buses, I think, is arguable, but freight trains, ships, really big things. Batteries simply just get too heavy to be practical in these end uses. Of course, hydrogen allows for faster refueling, which then leads to higher utilization of different assets. And then, of course, if we're talking blue hydrogen, it allows Canada to realize continued value from our resources and is actually going to be required to meet future energy demand. We don't believe electricity will be enough. So take this data from ourselves, CER and IEA, all kind of arrive at the same conclusions. These are all different organizations using different methodologies, all arriving at a similar conclusion, which says that electricity will need to more than double to meet future electrification needs. And if you look at the proportion in that plot there, it's roughly 60%. I mean, that number is of course, debatable, but it'll be roughly 60% of the energy mix in 2050. So the real question before us is where does that leave the other 40%? And many believe that hydrogen is the only good option for the end uses where direct electrification won't work. So I recognize I'm getting a little off topic here, but remember that 2.3 times increase in electrification from the previous slide. So that's this 700 terawatt hours of energy that's going to be needed per year. And if you agree that hydrogen is going to take up the proportion of the energy mix that we had in the previous slide, that actually amounts to 64 kilotons a day of hydrogen that'll be needed. So if that were to be made purely from green hydrogen, that's actually like a 4.5 times increase that we're going to need by 2050. And then you can see here in the bottom what that would be relative to today's Canada's natural gas production. So, this is a bit of an aside, but it's a case to be made for why, we're going to need multiple sources of hydrogen in our net zero future. And really what we want to do, and the purpose of this webinar today is focusing on transitioning end-use demand first so that the value chain configures around it to meet this demand. But I recognize that's for another webinar. All right, so now we've talked about why hydrogen, why transportation. Well, it's fairly straightforward. When you look at what Canadians pay for energy, the gap is smallest against transportation fuels, and of course, based on the topic we're talking about today, diesel. And in addition to that, transportation is also something that is constant and consistent in its consumption of energy. So it's certainly capable of driving early demand at scale. But clearly it's not going to be purely heavy trucking, long haul trucking that's going to be able to carry that demand forward. But it does act as an enabling element that then will facilitate other end uses adopting hydrogen as well. All right, so that's transportation. Now, why trucking? Well, it's really the only good option for zero emissions for moving big things long distances, which is what we're talking about today. What this will do is drive deployment of hydrogen technology and consumption of hydrogen at scale. And as we know, the economics of hydrogen does improve as that scale increases. It's one of the best options to quickly increase the use of hydrogen in a predictable way. As you can see here, there's a small number of trucks, relatively, of course, that consume a significant amount of fuel, have a significant GHG footprint, and drive a significant distance. So this is a really good use case, first use case for hydrogen. But it's a critical sector to Canada's economy, as you can see here on the right. A vast number of the volume of goods moved around in Canada are done by truck. It's a significant portion of Canada's GDP. Now, keep in mind, these numbers here are transportation and warehousing as a sector as a whole, not just long-haul heavy trucking. But the point is, it's a very important sector, and we do need to get this right. So that was the segue. Back to the problem statement and the solution. So what we're proposing here today, as Mark touched on, is what we're calling a minimum viable corridor framework. And we've chosen these words carefully. It is a minimum viable version of a corridor that's going to work. And it's a structured approach that we're proposing here. It's a framework. It's a structured approach to achieve an economically self-sustaining hydrogen value chain for long-haul heavy-duty transportation. So we've chosen these words carefully. The focus here is to ensure that stakeholders in this value chain have a line of sight to a business case for themselves and profitability that then will cause this ecosystem and value chain to self-sustain over a period of time. And this is our proposal to move past pilot projects. So really, there's two components to this. We've developed this through our deep analysis and engagement with key players across the value chain. So the first component is a qualitative one. We've developed a checklist, if you will, on the elements in regions that would need to be in place for a corridor to be successful. So these will be things like training, service technicians, and things like that that are somewhat qualitative. And then, of course, there's a quantitative aspect of this, and we're calling it a calibration. But basically, it's a parameterization of the various elements and quantifying those elements as a way of integrating, forming an integrated solution that allows for profitability for each of these stakeholders. And so this is where it fits into kind of the temporal scale. So clearly there's been a lot of effort and attention on pilot projects, and we think those are valuable, they're important. They allow for organizations to build experience, gain confidence, understand technology in the context of their organizations. But they have limited long-term value to the broader value chain. Typically, these benefits reside within the proponents of these pilot projects and aren't shared widely, although that's not the case across the board. So what we're proposing is this middle step between the pilot phase and broad commercial adoption that allows for shared learning and shared experience building. It engages the entire value chain to co-develop a shared vision of the future, one corridor leg at a time, and a number of other things. But it's this idea of convening, co-developing, and then co-implementing as well. Maybe these outcomes are fairly straightforward, but I'll go through them really, really quickly here one by one. So this is a very purposeful, strategic a framework that we're introducing. So this idea of calibration, focus, and deliberate steps being taken by different stakeholders in a phased and sequential way. We think this is going to result in self-sustaining hydrogen corridors and jumpstart the hydrogen value chain, much broader than just the primary value chain. Hubs will organically develop as nodes of corridors and will create interconnectivity across Canada. Corridors will take us beyond pilot projects and unlock demand at scale and spread that scale across regions, not just hubs themselves. We think it's going to create and improve and enhance confidence and give a clear line of sight for business viability for trucking companies and other stakeholders in the value chain. And we're going to do this through minimized investment. That's the whole minimum viable aspect of what we're proposing here. And we're going to do this through optimization and ensuring alignment of stakeholders across value chains. And again, this could look different. What we're proposing is a generic framework. And this could be tailored and applied in any part of Canada, adapted for each region or corridor leg or nodes, unique strengths and weaknesses and situations. And then we think this is going to also kickstart private investment, which will then take over from public funding. Because what we're doing is basically creating demand certainty, which has been missing up until this point. So a little bit about the long-haul heavy-duty hydrogen value chain. So clearly it's got many components and it's got different configurations that will look different by region. And what I mean by that is there's going to be different ways of making hydrogen. There's going to be different ways of transporting it around the landscape. And different regions could potentially have different end uses. Of course, today we're talking about long-haul heavy trucking, but regions will be looking at other opportunities to use hydrogen. But this is somewhat convoluted in terms of introducing this as a framework. So really, in a minimum viable sense, this can be simplified into primary components that make up this minimum viable aspect of this framework. And of course, it boils down to a typical supply chain that you would see both on the hydrogen fuel side as well as the technology side. So you see producers, distributors that then need to dispense that hydrogen, trucking companies that will buy that, and then of course there's the vehicle side as well. And the reason we want to depict this and the reason we continue using this term value chain might be obvious to some that know our webinars is we're really big on value chains because of this. It conveys this notion of all the links need to be strong. And if there's one weak link, the value chain just simply doesn't work. Trucking companies could buy, for example, 100 trucks and start operating them. But if you don't have the service technicians or the maintenance facilities, the whole value chain struggles. And this notion of the different elements of this value chain being interdependent, again, that might be an obvious statement, but it's a critical element of what we're proposing here. And sequencing. Certain elements of our framework need to happen before other elements. So we've thought through all of this, and there is a degree of phasing to what we're introducing today. Now, the scenarios we're presenting today are focused on fuel cell trucks. This is simply for illustration purposes, but we do want to acknowledge that hydrogen diesel dual fuel could play a very important enabling role in this because they have the potential to really de-risk things for heavy-duty trucking companies and place a significant amount of demand. If the bar to entry is a lot lower for hydrogen diesel dual fuel, they could be a really important enabling factor for scaling demand for fueling infrastructure, and then, of course, that upstream supply chain as well. And we want to stress certainty is a key principle here. So we are proposing, potentially stakeholder or multi-stakeholder agreements or contracts. And these will all be critical tools that drive action as these interdependencies, confidence builds in the way that these interdependencies are going to be implemented and executed on throughout the phasing of this corridor. So we've done a ton of engagement through the Edmonton Regional Hydrogen Hub, as well as through other initiatives. And I just wanted to share some of these observations, and you see those summarized here on the slide. So Trucking companies are the key stakeholder in the value chain. They pay for the entire value chain, the fuel, the trucks, the technology, the technicians, the drivers. So they are the key ones. We need to ensure that their needs are met. And there are some challenges. The trucking sector is very mature. It has low margins. It's highly competitive. They've got an established business model. And that profitability, their entire business viability depends on consistent operations. And as we saw with the pandemic, any sort of disruptions to those um, can lead to uncertainty and puts many companies on shaky ground. We want to stress they are not resistant to change. They are very on board with all the dialogue and the engagements that have been happening. But like all responsible institutions, they want to ensure that their business is going to remain viable if they need to adopt or adapt their business model to a net zero future. And so they're seeking to understand this transition as much as many of us through meaningful participation. Um, but if I could characterize it maybe in this way, there's a little bit of engagement fatigue as everyone keeps reaching out to them and asking them, what are your barriers? What do you need to succeed? And time again, it's kind of the same story. And this is what we mean by kind of these circular discussions. And so really what we're trying to introduce here today is something that is grounded in deep analysis, evidence, data, and structure. And allow for these trucking companies who really have no compelling case to change under the current existing policy and economic conditions, to be perfectly frank, and ensure that they can look at the hydrogen value chain and understand how their business fits into that and how they can adopt zero emission vehicles and really embrace this without impact to their business. And that's what we're trying to do here today. So, this is just, I wanted to flash this up in terms of the engagement that we've done. This is just a selection. And really, we've taken our engagement with many of the organizations whose logos I just flashed and others, over 80 stakeholder engagements in total, to develop this qualitative checklist. So we've reached across the entire value chain, primary, secondary, and tertiary elements of this, and we've assessed the readiness of these qualitative elements. We've formed an understanding of the non-quantitative risks, such as availability of vehicles, servicing capability, fuel availability, safety insurance, all these different things that you see here on the slide. And for each link in that value chain, we've formed a checklist that identifies and assesses the minimum needs and what gaps are there in terms of requirements for each value chain link. What stakeholders are positioned to address the need in question, and possible contracting mechanisms that could ensure those needs will be met. And for illustration, up on screen, I've got kind of a table here that forms a portion of the basis of what we're proposing as part of this framework. The second piece is a quantitative calibration of each of these value chain elements. And the question we ask ourselves is, what are the minimum conditions that will allow for profitability in each link of the value chain? And so clearly there's framework inputs, there's using the most current knowledge from the engagements that we've done and the analysis that we've achieved, that we've got under our belt here across the value chain. We've ensured that these can be optimized to provide the best range of solutions, accounting for regional or stakeholder differences. Remember, what we're proposing here is generic and can be applied across Canada. And then there's outputs from this framework. And these outputs serve as a starting point to advance meaningful discussions amongst key stakeholders that go beyond simply just, what are your barriers, what are your needs? We know what those are. We're now entering into really meaningful discussions that talk about how we achieve those and how those needs can be aligned and what the minimum conditions are for an economically viable value chain, and what sort of investment will be required to get over that economic viability hurdle. So we're talking in specifics now. Things like the size and number of fueling stations, the number and types of trucks needed, the fuel usage, costs, all these different things. I'll take you through some of those elements at a very high level over the next couple slides. So of course, we've taken a look at the TCO, total cost of ownership, diesel versus hydrogen. We've got these scenarios for hydrogen diesel dual fuel, and we've made some projections even for hydrogen internal combustion as well. And what we see here is certainly the cost of hydrogen trucks, or this is on a TCO basis, I'm not talking on a CapEx basis. This is all TCO, so CapEx and OpEx built in. The cost of hydrogen trucks will go down. The cost of diesel trucks will go up, and this is, by design, the carbon tax and things like that. But the gap will never close between the two of those. And a significant gap will remain at the close of this decade. And so what we really need is deliberate action to ensure that that gap does close. So these scenarios are outlined against today's policies and economic conditions. On the right, you see the breakdown of where this TCO comes from. And at the risk of making an obvious statement, it's the truck and fuel costs. And those are the key factors for economic viability. And then we've looked on the supply side, right? So clearly hydrogen cost is a summation of production, delivery, and dispensing costs. And in all cases, making, moving, and dispensing costs decrease with economies of scale. And the other observation is that costs are drastically affected by delivery method. And you can see that in the plot on the right. You can see where the diesel parity range sits relative to different delivery methods at different capacities and ending in pipeline, which actually gets us fairly close. And then we've looked at the different parameters of the fueling stations themselves. So as we know, retail price is sensitive to CapEx and OpEx. And so this is what we meant by parameterization. So we do need large scale. We do need high utilization rates to minimize the impact of high CapEx, capital expenditures. But there is an optimization that's needed on many of these parameters. And we've looked at a lot more than what's listed here on the slide. And a couple of observations. So most pilot projects aren't scalable to profitability. That's one observation. And the other, regarding the optimization piece, is we can find a threshold where there's diminishing returns. And you can kind of see that on the plot there. There is a threshold above which, the station can get bigger, but it's not actually dropping the price at the nozzle by much. And this actually applies across different parameters like utilization and things like that. And so our model is able to identify these thresholds, and we're able to leverage that to create optimized scenarios. Again, hearkening back to this minimum viable element of what we're proposing. All right. So how do we reach economic viability? So this is just an example scenario for illustrative purposes. And we think this is fairly novel. So we've looked at this in an integrated way. Rather than just looking at TCO of trucks, for example, and techno-economics of the hydrogen supply chain, price at the nozzle, we've integrated this and basically looked at what the maximum price trucking companies can afford to pay based on their TCO and parity with diesel. And we've looked at what the minimum retail price fueling stations need to charge to make that a reality against all the techno-economics that they've got there. So that green band that you see there is the price of hydrogen that's economically viable. Yes, we're going to need public money to help reduce that cost, but we can actually quantify exactly what that is and articulate what exactly they're going to get for that. And as I keep stressing, different value chain configurations are going to lead to different scenario results. And you'll see this repeated in future slides. This is an answer. This is not the answer. So where does that leave us? That brings us to kind of an amalgam of what I've kind of brought you through in the last 15 minutes or so. So we've got a qualitative, value chain readiness checklist. And this is by no means comprehensive here, right? So we're looking, of course, at the primary value chain elements, but of course, also secondary value chain elements, right? Finance, risk management, vehicle supply and service, and recognizing that there's a whole upstream element to that as well, from parts to training to maintenance to telematics and ELDs and things of that nature. And then, of course, I've covered off the hydrogen supply side. And we've talked about these calibrated quantitative parameters as well. And in an illustrative scenario here, we're talking about 100 trucks in commercial operation in the fuel cell electric vehicle case, what these trucks are going to consume, how far each truck needs to travel per year over a 10-year period in order to consume enough to create demand certainty for the station element of it, 3 fueling stations, 4 tons a day, and on and on and on. So we've parameterized all these different elements. And again, these need to be calibrated based on where this corridor is and what the unique situation is there. But you can see here, these are very specific and deliberate elements that need to be implemented. And this is really what we're proposing the framework does. So if you unpack that and look at the financial implications of this, what you have here is a scenario over 10 years, and this is just one particular example, of course, as I keep saying, this is a generic framework. This is just an illustrative example to take you through what this might look like in action. So over that 10-year period, in this particular case, we're looking at a $582 million that the private sector will put into operating this corridor over a 10-year period. And I want to say only, I know 150 million is a lot, but this is what's going to be needed from a public investment. And I want to stress this is not, an upfront payment. We're talking about this over a 10-year period. So there is sequencing and phasing. The scenario we outline here assumes an overnight build, which obviously doesn't jive with the real world. And what that gets us is 120 trucks, 3 4-ton-a-day stations, 99% reliability, and a whole bunch of other things. Again, I'm trying to keep it very concise and succinct here. So as I said, that scenario assumes an overnight build. The actual scenario would actually be sequenced. So for example, the 120 trucks don't arrive on day one. They simply can't. But it actually fulfills these interdependent stakeholder needs. One of the things the vehicle OEMs are not going to be able to do, number one, is deliver 120 trucks on day one. And likely they're going to want these orders staggered, for example, over a 5-year period, right? So, whatever number of trucks it would take per year, let's call it 25. Sorry, my math isn't great right now off the top of my head. The station construction is going to be sequenced as well. That means the money needed is going to be phased as well. And so, these are all things that need to be calibrated and aligned for each unique corridor case. As I said, these results are an answer; they're not the answer. These results are greatly impacted by the assumptions that are made, i.e., what technology we're talking about, the level of redundancy that we feel is needed. So we've chosen 3 stations for a 99% redundancy. Other regions may have a different approach. And then, of course, things like fuel delivery. This is going to be huge, right? Is it gas tube trailer delivery? Is it liquid? And again, that might differ depending on which region in Canada we're talking about. The other observation we've made is the first minimum viable corridor is important. Clearly, we think that. But it is going to be expensive. But the point we're trying to make is subsequent minimum viable corridors would actually reduce in cost as the learnings grow. Certainly, if the next corridor is a continuation of an existing leg, that's less stations that are needed. potentially trucks from the first leg would be able to operate on the second leg. There's a number of different reasons, again. And an important takeaway here is the first minimum viable corridor could be funded up to 80% by the private sector, with, again, only 20% public investment. And then we think that this is going to jumpstart demand certainty that then allows for investment from the private sector to take over. Now that the minimum viable nature of this is already in place. So, each incremental number of trucks or number of stations or hydrogen production and supply come online, there's already confidence that the value chain is established. It's growing, it's learning, and it's becoming more mature with every year that passes. All right, so further implications here. Key issue is new hydrogen infrastructure needs to be built. Again, this could vary depending on where you are in Canada. There's many ways to build it. Some forms of infrastructure are more efficient than others. End users pay for the entire value chain. We've covered that. We need to focus on demand, almost more than supply, but recognizing, of course, there needs to be alignment between the two. But one of the struggles that the supply side has is, they've been early adopters, they've stood up and established supply. Now we're wondering where all the demand is. But to do that, the conditions for transitioning need to be attractive. And these organizations, and again, in this case, trucking companies, need to have that clear line of sight to business viability if they transition. We talked about hydrogen diesel dual fuel technology. That's a potential significant de-risking element. And we want to encourage people thinking about, not getting tripped up by imperfect steps. We need to ask ourselves what we're trying to accomplish here. Is it really emissions reductions, or is it net zero in 2050? And, putting in the enabling factors to make sure that we can get there, and making sure that electricity, hydrogen, biofuels, and fossil fuels with carbon capture can all be viable in 2050 on their own as key energy carriers and supporting technologies in the case of carbon capture. And so if you believe that, we shouldn't get tripped up by what might seem like imperfect steps. That's I would argue is short-term thinking. So we think it's okay to start with higher carbon intensity hydrogen if it means that it's available and affordable today, because that gets fleets and other end uses transitioning over to hydrogen and starting to establish hydrogen as a credible, compelling, and capable energy carrier as part of our energy system. And, just like parts of our electricity grid are dirty today, doesn't mean people aren't driving electric vehicles. We know that we can clean up those portions of our grid in the next coming decades. And we think that that's the same for hydrogen. It's more important on the demand side to ensure that there's confidence and consistency and market signals in that respect. And so that's the reason why we're supporting technology like hydrogen diesel dual fuel, as long as we recognize and understand that these are steps in a pathway to net zero. And finally, this idea of using the minimum viable framework to help identify what decision or what approach is a good one and frankly a bad one. So I just want to conclude with talking about potential next steps towards implementing minimum viable corridors. Some actions. So using this framework to advance discussions, again, talking about really specific things and how these are going to be implemented in consideration of every unique aspect of a corridor leg that we might be looking at across Canada. And having these discussions with key stakeholders. And those stakeholders might be different in Alberta, they might be different in BC, they might be different in Quebec. But the value chain, the premise, the framework are all common. Developing a shared vision for a minimum viable corridor with a critical mass of stakeholders across the value chain and focusing on these early adopters. aligning existing policies, programs, and public investments with the minimum viable corridor concept and specific findings, right? So, for example, if government has a decision ahead of them on a pilot project, we would encourage them to think about those in the context more holistically, right, of a minimum viable corridor. Of course, if we're talking about long haul heavy trucking here. And some of the principles to keep in mind. So the public sector, so carrying on that thinking, the public sector should only support highly strategic pilots that increase understanding and confidence very broadly across stakeholders. Um, and public investments should be tied to a requirement to share their learnings. Because right now, we should consider ourselves in rather a pre-competitive phase because I don't know if hydrogen necessarily is entrenched. Right now, we're building and creating a new value chain for a new energy carrier that is going to be needed if Canada is to achieve net zero in 2050. We should be focusing on early industry adopters and those motivated to drive change. We need to ensure public investments advance public good. So lowest cost option for minimal viable corridors, the entire premise of what we're proposing today, and ensuring that decisions don't lock in monopolies at this point in time. And finally, to embrace independent intermediaries to drive progress. So supporting deep techno-economic analysis, encouraging stakeholder relationships, taking a strategic view on things, all kind of key elements of the framework that we've outlined for you all today. And with that, I want to thank you all for joining us, the Transition Accelerator and the Edmonton Region Hydrogen Hub as part of our webinar series with this webinar today. And I will stop there and try to navigate through all of these questions. And I'll probably rely on my colleague Mark for that as well.
Yeah, so maybe I'll
Thank you
jump
all.
in there, Phil. Yeah, just a reminder to everybody, if you do have like burning questions, put them in the Q&A and upvote the ones that you want discussed. With over 100 attendees, there's been a lot of chatter in the chat, which is great. And there's been some questions in there too. It's tough to keep track of what questions people are actually interested in discussing if it's not in the, like, we have two separate panels for the Q&A chat. I know that seems silly to be that sort of mundane, but it really does help when you put the questions in the chat. I've had a bit of time here, Phil, to think about some of the answers. So maybe I'll jump in and then let you add some color. One of them, well, the first one actually in the chat is, what's the status of hydrogen refueling and mobile refuelers in Canada? And what have we learned about it? Well, I guess I want to frame that by saying first we need to keep in mind what our objective is, and that our objective is developing an economically self-sustaining hydrogen value chain. So that question's a little bit out of context, I would say, but what we have learned is that scale matters. The larger the station, the larger the infrastructure, the lower the costs can be. And scale, along with utilization, are some of the biggest levers that we have to achieving economic viability for the hydrogen value chain. Now, that's not to say that mobile and small scale fuelers don't have a really important role. They play an important role in the step of building confidence and awareness in hydrogen vehicles and familiarity and all of that great stuff that we've been already doing, I would argue, as a country, launching pilot projects, demonstration projects, things like that. But they're not a direct pathway to economic viability. Most of these small scale pilots and things like that, once the pilot project is over, it's over, and there's no path to economic viability. So what we're talking about here is a pathway to a self-sustaining, economically viable fueling station, which, as Phil said, means big fueling stations and lots of trucks dedicated to those fueling stations to keep the economic viability of the fueling stations afloat, but also having hydrogen and vehicles at a price and total cost of ownership at a price that makes profitable sense for the trucking companies. I don't know, Phil, if you have any color to add to that or not.
You answer that well.
Okay, another one, 120 trucks. Is that for all of Canada or all of Alberta? I mean, I guess that's a simple answer, Phil. Maybe I'll throw that one at you so I can take a breather.
Sorry, I was reading actually a question. I'll hand that over to you. That's okay.
Okay. Yeah. So the 120 trucks, I guess what we want to emphasize is that this is one scenario of one corridor. And what we picture is multiple corridors sort of growing from this minimum viable corridor. So where that first corridor is, if it's in Alberta or BC or Eastern Canada or wherever, is almost irrelevant. What we've come up with is the framework to describe that corridor, how many trucks should be on it, depending on the mix of technology, whether it's fuel cell or dual fuel or hydrogen combustion was also brought up somewhere in the chat. Um, and it's a generic model to describe the conditions for success for that corridor, which is just the start of an entire network of corridors, I would say. Do you find a question that you want to answer, Phil?
No, I'll let you keep going.
Okay. What is the split of spend between the 120 trucks, the 3 fueling stations, and fuel supply of the $600 million total cost? So I think you have that a few slides back. This one. Yeah, so I guess the split is, I mean, you'd have to add it up, 570 million from the trucking sector plus 106 million of subsidies for the trucking sector. And then what is that, 55 million for the supply sector? So the majority of the investment, public and private, needs to go into the demand side, the trucks, and getting trucks on the road to create demand. Okay, there was another question in the chat, and I'll throw it up or I'll talk about it and see if I can paraphrase it. It was about where did the 60% subsidy? So I think maybe go back up. We had that slide on fueling station utilization and well, I think one more. This one, I think. So in there, somebody astutely picked up that there's a 60% CapEx subsidy in this scenario. I mean, that's a great question. I guess what I want to stress is that this is a scenario and there's a gap that we identified in retail fuel price that fueling stations would be willing to offer and still be profitable, and retail fuels prices that trucking companies should be willing to pay and still be profitable. And what this really represents is just one scenario that closes that gap. So that's just an example of how do we close the gap in this scenario. It's purely illustrative, and it's one of many possible configurations of the value chain that achieves those targets and makes the whole value chain economically viable for both the fueling station operator and the truck owner. We're not proposing this is the program design or anything like that. Again, this is the framework and the starting point for, I guess, the next level of meaningful discussion. There is, let's see, do you find any other questions in the Q&A you want to address, Phil? There's one on regulatory risks.
Sure, you can tackle that one.
Yeah, do you want to do that one? So we're regulatory risks identified as key barrier to MVC implementation. I think you're closer to regulatory than I am.
Right. So that, again, what we're proposing here is a framework. And so that would fall under the qualitative checklist. So we do have that on there. And, through that qualitative aspect of the value chain readiness assessment, we would see which corridors are closer to implementation than others, and regulatory would clearly be a piece there. I would say for the most part on the technology side, the regulations are fairly well established. And again, the reason why we've approached this in a framework sense is a lot of the regulatory, I don't want to say hurdles, but regulatory headwinds in any particular region might be local authorities not having the experience with approving hydrogen installations or hydrogen projects in their jurisdiction. And that's nothing against those local authorities. It's simply them not just having that experience. And so understandably, they would be quite cautious with approving, initial set of projects or installations. And that would be identified again, as I said, as part of that qualitative checklist. And then organizations like ours and others would be open to supporting and lubricating that like a regulatory process wherever that might be. Again, the point of things like this is that shared learnings so that we're able to deploy and establish that hydrogen value chain across Canada.
So there's a couple in the chat. Again, it's really tough to kind of go back and find these questions in the chat if they're not in the Q&A. But one of them was the gist of it was, is there a point when government subsidies are no longer needed? And what is the time frame of those government subsidies sort of waning down, I would say. So maybe I'll take a stab at this here again, Phil, and you can add some color. The answer is yes, there would be. What that looks like, it really depends on the participants, their willingness to act, a whole bunch of conditions that are, quite frankly, there's a lot of uncertainty around right now. But again, we have the framework to advance those discussions and run a bunch of what if scenarios. Like, what if this, what if that? What if fueling station providers do this? What if trucking companies do this? What if government does this? But that said, earlier on, Phil was talking about the first minimum viable corridor is going to be the most expensive. And, it's, quote unquote, a one-time investment to stand up the corridor. That investment over the length of the corridor, 10-year period, would make that corridor independently self-sustainable from an economic point of view. But one of the key things that we discovered is like the minimum viable corridor, the station utilization is actually only 40%. So it can support more trucks than the minimum amount to make it economically viable. So there's some room, some headroom there, I guess, if you will, in an economic sense, to add more trucks without subsidy and make the whole corridor more profitable, make the whole value chain more profitable. And then the other thing is to add on to the corridor, a branch to the corridor. You only have to add one fueling station and a couple of, handful of trucks, not a handful, but 30 to 50-ish trucks to support that one new fueling station, which again drops that economic bar to viability. And then that just continues on and perpetuates. And then of course, as vehicle prices come down and as hydrogen fueling equipment comes down with economies of scale and mass manufacturing and all that good stuff, it just keeps ratcheting down the need for public investment. All of that stuff could be modeled out, but there's no point in, like, I think we're at the point now of advancing real discussions and real investments with real investors and real proponents. And this sort of ties into Mark Kirby had a comment in the chat box as well that we do need this integrated investment across the value chain. And we also need to think in terms of the risk management to reach FID for everybody along that value chain. Like that's exactly what where we're going with this, I guess. I don't know, Phil, if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, absolutely. What I think we're proposing here is the ability to be able to articulate exactly what a proposal for a corridor looks like. And then again, maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but we're talking individual corridors here, but really the future vision, I believe, is a network. And so this is a plan with very deliberate steps on how to stand that up one leg at a time and being able to quantify that from an investment standpoint, from all the parameters of the corridor in terms of number of stations, trucks, utilization, and so forth.
So we do have 5 minutes left. There's a couple more questions. Does the demand side of your analysis only consider trucking as an end-use application, or do you have other scenarios where you've considered demand from transit or other end-use applications? You want me to take a stab at that one, Phil?
Please.
So I guess the simple answer is for the sake of illustration, again, we looked primarily at the demand from heavy duty trucking. However, we do have models for transit and as well as coach buses. And we actually have models for non-transportation use of hydrogen as well. And how so we basically we have models for the whole value chain. And the reason that we're focusing on minimum viable corridors and heavy duty trucking is because we've really, really zeroed in on that as the key to unlocking all of it. And just to give you an example, like transit buses on their own are barely enough to support a single fueling station when you have all of the buses in a fleet transitioned sort of thing. And that's a really tall ask for a municipality to transition all of their buses. It really is. So it's a great augment, and all of the work that we do in all of those other sectors are going to make this whole thing easier. And by that I mean cheaper. But it was the simplest scenario to run was just with a single source of demand for heavy duty trucks. It's a really high level at this point, but as we get into more substantive discussions, those are the actual, conversations we need to have is like, okay, how many actual trucks and how many actual buses in what years can be committed to, and what are the barriers for investment to signing those purchase orders? That's really what it comes down to. Anything to add on that, Phil?
No, no answer.
Okay, we've got that's a long question, so I'll skip it and I'll pass this one to you while I read the other question, Phil. Are there any examples of cross-border hydrogen corridors, specifically Canada, US?
Uh, Not for hydrogen. There is an EV charging one out east. I'm blanking on, but it's kind of Quebec, Ontario, and into Ohio, I believe, or Michigan. Sorry. But no, I'm not aware of any for hydrogen right now. I mean, everyone, our audience may be aware, stateside, the investment that the DOE has made into the hydrogen hubs and to the tune of 7 billion, and then of course the other 40 billion in follow-on private investment. So similar ratios to what we're talking about here. But those hubs, I think, will now take some time to get up off the ground. But once those are up and running, absolutely, I see a scenario where our corridors will be connecting. And the data is actually pretty staggering. I think don't quote me on this, but I think it's over 80% of trade between of goods movement between Canada and the US is done by truck. So those corridors down into the States are going to be very important. I just also want to add that we are we do regularly speak with, organizations down in the States that are standing up their versions of corridors, just to kind of compare notes and understand what they're doing that might work in a Canadian context and vice versa. So.
Okay, well, we are at time. We have about, 30 seconds left, lightning round. Hydrogen vehicles, hydrogen produced from natural gas, can they easily transition to green hydrogen? The easy answer to that is yes. There's no difference in the actual hydrogen molecule as long as it doesn't matter how it's produced, as long as it meets the purity levels needed for the technology. So that's an easy one. What are the value chain components do you see public funding most necessary for? That's not going to be an easy question. I think we're out of time. But I think the order that was postulated here, CapEx for vehicles, distribution CapEx, refueling infra CapEx, those are definitely some of the big portions of what the public funding will be needed for sure. So I think that's a wrap for us. Thanks everybody for your time and attention. We look forward to further engagement and reach out anytime. Happy to engage further. Thanks everyone.